I was making dinner, waiting for my husband to come home from a business trip. My phone buzzed, it was him. But instead of "I love you," the message read, "Pack your things and get out. I'm coming back with my new girlfriend. You're no longer needed." I didn't cry. I packed up, called a lawyer, and left something on the table he'd never forget when he walked back in. My name is Ivy Collins and I'm 34 years old. The last normal thing I did was stir a pot of pasta sauce. The scent of garlic and basil, a smell I used to think meant home, filled the quiet kitchen. I remember glancing at the clock on the stove, its digital face glowing a placid 7:15 p.m. I was waiting for my husband, Derek Shaw, to get home from a business trip to Austin. Our house, usually humming with the low thrum of his constant phone calls and the news channel he always left on, was still. It was a comfortable silence, the kind you settle into after a decade of marriage. We had a routine, Derek and I. He was the charismatic frontman of his own small marketing agency, a job that required a lot of travel, a lot of dinners, a lot of convincing people of things. I was the back office, the one who kept the lights on. Literally, the mortgage on our 3-bedroom colonial, all $312,000 of it, was paid automatically from my account. I handled the utilities, the groceries, the car insurance. Our life ran on a series of spreadsheets I'd designed, a quiet engine of order humming beneath the surface of his chaotic brilliance. When his agency hit a rough patch last year, I'd funneled $27,500 of my own savings into it, no questions asked. I thought of it as an investment in us. The house was ours, but the down payment had come entirely from the inheritance my grandmother left me. It was my anchor, the one solid thing in a life that often felt like it was in motion around Derek. I checked my phone, setting the wooden spoon down on a ceramic rest next to the stove. I was expecting a text about his flight being delayed or maybe a quick "landed, see you soon." My thumb hovered over our message history, a string of my questions and his brief, efficient replies. The screen lit up with an incoming message and I smiled. Right on cue, the phone buzzed in my hand. It was Derek, not a call, a text. My smile faded as I read the first line. The words were simple, clinical, like a line from a corporate memo. "I'm not coming home to you. I've met someone. I'll be back Sunday to get my things, so please be gone." My breath caught in my throat. I read it again, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. A second text popped up before I could process the first. "Her name is Sophie. She's coming with me." I didn't drop the phone. I didn't scream or cry out. My hand remained steady. The gentle heat radiating from the stove felt 1,000 miles away, a warmth from another life. The rich aroma of the simmering sauce suddenly seemed cloying, suffocating. I stood there in the silent kitchen, the phone in my hand, reading the two messages over and over. He wasn't asking me to leave. He wasn't suggesting a separation. He was ordering me out of my own home, the one I paid for, the one I'd filled with our life. The shock wasn't a wave of emotion, it was a cold, sharp-edged fact that inserted itself into my reality. He wanted me gone by Sunday. In that frozen moment, I understood something with perfect clarity. He counted on me to crumble. He expected tears, begging, a frantic packing of a single suitcase in the dead of night. He counted on me to absorb this problem just like I'd absorbed all the others, the missed anniversaries, the late-night excuses, the vague explanations for credit card charges. He counted on me to disappear quietly, but in his planning, in his cruel efficiency, he'd forgotten one crucial detail. He'd forgotten who paid the bills, who owned the deed. He'd forgotten who held all the passwords. I reached over and turned off the stove. The burner clicked off with a final, metallic sound. The sauce would go bad. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing in this kitchen mattered anymore. I walked out of the room, leaving the spoon on its rest, and went to my home office. It was the one room in the house that was entirely mine, organized to my exact specifications, with a filing cabinet he'd never once opened. My hand didn't shake as I pulled open the second drawer, the one labeled household. Inside, nestled in a protective plastic sleeve, was the deed to the house. I slid the thick paper out. One name was typed under the heading of grantee. Ivy Collins, my anchor. I pulled out the file for our joint bank accounts next, flipping through the most recent statements. I saw the withdrawals he'd made over the past month. Small at first, $100 here, $200 there. Then larger, $1,000 just last week. He thought my obsessive organization was just a quirk, a little hobby. He never realized it was a record, a perfect, dated history of our lives, a history of his lies. I still hadn't cried. The time for that would be later or maybe never. Right now, something else was taking hold, a cold, methodical anger that felt more powerful than grief. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed "best divorce attorneys" into the search bar. The first result was a firm with a sleek, modern website. I clicked on a profile. A woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression stared back from the screen. I found a name, Laura Chen, a divorce attorney whose website tagline read, "No-nonsense representation." That's what I needed. Her site listed a 24-hour line for emergencies. I picked up my phone, the one still holding his devastating texts, and dialed. A calm voice answered. I didn't let my own voice crack. "My name is Ivy Collins," I said, the words clear and steady. "My husband just left me. I need to freeze our assets immediately." Laura Chen's office was minimalist and efficient, just like her photo. All glass, steel, and muted gray tones. She met me at 8 o'clock the next morning, a cup of black coffee already waiting for me on the polished conference table. I didn't tell her a long, rambling story of heartbreak. I didn't cry, I gave her facts. I showed her the text messages from Derek. I handed her a copy of the deed to the house with my name on it. I told her about the $27,500 of my inheritance that I'd put into his failing business. I was a client with a problem and she was a professional with a solution. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I was done, she took a slow sip of her own coffee and nodded. She wasn't emotional. She was a strategist. "Okay, Ivy," she said, her voice crisp. "Here's what we do first." She laid out the initial steps like a battle plan. "First, we lock down the money. He can't fund his new life with your savings." She explained exactly how to do it. A simple call to the bank, a visit to the branch manager if necessary, citing a marital dispute. It was a standard procedure. The joint savings account had a balance of $62,400. The checking account had $12,900. She assured me it could all be frozen by noon. Then she looked at the copy of the deed again. "The house is legally, unequivocally yours," she confirmed, her words a balm on a wound I didn't even know was bleeding. "He's not ordering you out of your home, he's a guest who has overstayed his welcome." The phrase sent a shiver of strength through me. A guest, that's all he was now. Finally, she slid a business card across the table. "I want you to call this man, he's a private investigator. Let's not guess what Derek was doing in Austin. Let's know." I walked out of her sterile, air-conditioned office and didn't go home. I went directly to my bank branch, the one I'd been using since I opened my first savings account with birthday money at age 16. The branch manager, a kind man named Mr. Henderson, knew me by name. He'd helped me secure the mortgage for my house. He smiled when he saw me approach his desk. "Ivy, good to see you. What can I help you with today?" I sat down, my purse in my lap, and folded my hands. I met his eyes and used the calmest voice I could manage. "Mr. Henderson, I need to place an immediate freeze on all joint accounts held with my husband, Derek Shaw." His friendly expression didn't falter, but a flicker of professional concern crossed his face. He didn't ask any invasive questions or pry for details. He simply nodded, his gaze compassionate. "Of course, Ivy, I can take care of that for you right now." He turned to his computer and his fingers began to move across the keyboard. I watched the screen from my side of the desk, seeing our account numbers, our shared financial life displayed in black and white. With a few clicks, he locked the funds. It felt like flipping a massive switch, a silent thunderclap that only I could hear. I thought about Derek in Austin, probably at a celebratory brunch with Sophie. I imagined him reaching for his wallet, pulling out the debit card linked to our joint account, so confident and expansive. The word declined in harsh red letters flashed in my mind. A small, sharp smile touched my lips for the first time in nearly 12 hours. This wasn't about being petty, it wasn't about the money itself, it was about the assumption. The absolute, unshakable certainty he had that my resources, my safety net, my inheritance were his to burn on his way out the door. I walked out of the bank feeling lighter than I had in years. I still hadn't cried, I had acted. The private investigator's name was Gabe Porter. When I called the number Laura had given me, his voice on the other end was gravelly and direct like stones rolling in a riverbed. There was no secretary, no hold music, just him. "Porter, my name is Ivy Collins," I began. "Laura Chen recommended you. What do you need?" he asked, no time for pleasantries. I appreciated his directness. "My husband is on what he calls a business trip to Austin." "He's not. He's there with his new girlfriend. Her name is Sophie Blake." I told him what I needed, making my voice as clear and precise as his. "I don't need blurry photos of them holding hands. I need a paper trail. I want flight records, hotel receipts, car rentals, dinner bills charged to our joint cards. I need a timeline of his business trip with every dollar accounted for." There was a brief pause on the other end. "You want his story, but with receipts," Gabe said. It was the perfect summary. "I can do that." He told me his fee, a flat rate for a 48-hour investigation. I didn't even flinch. I opened my banking app while we were still on the phone and transferred the retainer from my personal account, the one Derek had no access to, the one I'd kept funded with my own freelance graphic design work over the years. This was another investment, not in a failing marriage but in a clean, undeniable exit. "Got it," he said a moment after I hit send. "You'll have something from me within 2 days." Hanging up the phone, a strange realization settled over me. I was building a team, me, a sharp lawyer, and a no-nonsense private investigator. Derek had his Sophie, his accomplice in tearing our life apart. I had professionals, my accomplices in methodically taking it back. That night, the house felt enormous. The silence I'd found comfortable just 24 hours ago now felt cavernous and empty. I walked through the rooms I had so carefully decorated, the spaces I had filled with comfortable furniture and soft lighting. Every object seemed to mock me, a testament to a life that was a lie. I saw all the things he took for granted. The high-speed internet I spent a week researching to get the best deal, the smart thermostat I installed myself to save on the heating bill, the pantry I kept perfectly stocked with his favorite snacks. He hadn't just left me, he'd abandoned the entire support system that allowed his life to run smoothly. I saw it with a sudden, brutal clarity. I wasn't a wife, I was an administrator. And my position had just been terminated without notice. So I resigned. I went to my office and took out a yellow legal pad. It wasn't a list of sorrows or a diary of my pain, it was a to-do list. Item 1. Cancel his supplementary credit card. I called the company and reported it lost. A new one would be issued to me at my new address whenever I decided to get one. Item 2. Change all streaming service passwords. Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max, all gone. Item 3. Schedule utility shutoffs. This one was the most satisfying. I would time it perfectly. I worked my way down the list, each small act a reclamation of my life, my home, my finances. When I was finally tired, I went upstairs. I walked past the master bedroom, our bedroom, without a glance. The king-sized bed, the matching nightstands, the photos of us on the wall, it all felt like a museum exhibit I was no longer interested in. I went into the guest room, pulled back the simple quilt, and fell asleep immediately. Gabe Porter was true to his word. An email arrived in my inbox less than 2 days later on Friday morning. The subject line was stark and efficient: Austin findings preliminary. My hand was steady as I moved the mouse and clicked it open. The attachment was a single PDF document. I opened it and took a deep breath. There they were. The facts. The first page contained flight records, 2 round-trip tickets to Austin booked a month ago, one for Derek Shaw, one for Sophie Blake. His was paid for with his business account, hers was paid for with our joint savings. The next page had hotel receipts. He wasn't staying at a business-class Marriott or a Hilton. He was at a trendy, expensive boutique hotel called the Ember. The total for a 5-night stay in a romance suite came to $38.42. Charged, of course, to our joint credit card. Then came the photos. They weren't blurry, long-lens shots taken from across the street. They were crystal clear, probably pulled from social media. Derek and Sophie were sitting at an outdoor cafe, laughing, her head resting on his shoulder. They looked easy, happy, bathed in the warm Texas sun. Seeing her face was a jolt. She was young, maybe late 20s, with that effortless, vibrant look of someone who had never had to worry about a mortgage payment. I felt a flicker of something, a cold knot in my stomach. I waited for the jealousy, for the sting of inadequacy. But it never came. All I felt was a pure, clarifying anger. He was funding their romantic getaway with the money I saved for our future, for a new roof, for retirement. Gabe, thorough as promised, had also attached links to their social media profiles. Derek's was private, but Sophie's was wide open to the world. Her bio read, "Starting a new chapter in a new city with my one and only." She had already tagged Derek in a photo of 2 champagne glasses clinking together on their hotel balcony, the Austin skyline glittering behind them. She wasn't a secret, she was a declaration. The hotel bill wasn't just a summary, it was itemized. I read every line, my anger solidifying into something as hard and cold as diamond. Room service charges for champagne and chocolate-covered strawberries. A 90-minute couples massage at the hotel's luxury spa. 2 plush, monogrammed robes charged to the room. He wasn't just having an affair. He was building a fantasy life for her, a life of ridiculous, movie-style romance, using the money I meticulously saved by clipping coupons and comparing insurance rates. I pulled up my own calendar on my laptop, the one where I tracked our appointments and anniversaries. My finger traced back to the date he'd charged the couple's massage. It was Wednesday, our wedding anniversary. I remembered the text he'd sent me that afternoon, a text I'd thought was so sweet at the time. "Thinking of you, this deal is taking all my energy, can't wait to be home." The lie wasn't just in the affair. It was in every single word he'd said to me for weeks, maybe even months. Every "I love you," every "miss you" was a layer of paint over a rotten foundation. With a grim sense of purpose, I printed every page of Gabe's report. The flight confirmations, the hotel bill, the smiling photos. I used a red pen to circle the charge for the couple's massage. I highlighted the name Sophie Blake on the airline ticket. I placed each sheet into a clear plastic sleeve. This was my evidence, my proof. This wasn't just an infidelity anymore. This was a financial audit of his character, and he had failed spectacularly. He hadn't just cheated on me, he had embezzled from our marriage. With the evidence file sitting on my desk, my plan for the house solidified. It was no longer just a vague idea, it had a timeline and a purpose. I picked up the phone and started with the utility companies. The accounts for gas, electricity, internet, and cable were all in my name, all linked directly to my personal bank account. It had always been easier that way, I'd told myself. Derek was too busy to deal with it. Now that simple convenience became my greatest weapon. I spoke to a cheerful representative at the power company first. "Yes, I'd like to schedule a service disconnection for my address," I said, my voice pleasant and calm. I gave her the date, Sunday, "as early as possible, please," I added. 8 a.m. would be perfect. I did the same for the gas company and then for the internet and cable provider. By the time I hung up the final call, it was done. I imagined him walking in on Sunday afternoon, flipping a light switch and getting nothing, trying the Wi-Fi and finding no signal. He would expect to find the home I had always maintained, warm and welcoming and fully functional. He would find only darkness and silence. Then I started packing, but I wasn't packing my things to leave, I was packing his. I drove to the hardware store and bought a dozen plain, medium-sized cardboard boxes and a roll of packing tape. Back at the house, I went to work. I started in our master closet. Every one of his suits, every shirt I'd carefully ironed, every pair of shoes he'd left on the floor, it all went into the boxes. I moved to the dresser, emptying drawers of his socks and t-shirts. In the bathroom, his expensive cologne, his electric razor, the jar of face cream he pretended he didn't use, all of it was swept into a box. I was methodical, unemotional. I was an archivist of a dead relationship, cataloging and storing the artifacts of a man I no longer knew. I stacked most of the boxes neatly in the garage by the door he always used. He could load them into his car himself, but I reserved one box for something else. It was a plain white photo box I'd picked up at a craft store. It was clean, unassuming, almost elegant in its simplicity. It looked like a box for treasured memories. Inside, I didn't put his belongings. I put the truth. First, I placed a handful of our wedding photos on the bottom. Not the formal, posed shots, but the candid ones from the reception, the ones where we were laughing, where we looked genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. A reminder of the reality he was choosing to throw away. Next, I added the annotated bank statements. I had highlighted every charge from Austin, every unexplained cash withdrawal from the past 3 months. On top of that went the itemized hotel receipts from the Ember, with the champagne and the anniversary couple's massage circled in thick red ink. Then came the printed photos of him and Sophie, their carefree smiles staring up from the glossy paper. I didn't need to write a long, angry letter. The evidence spoke for itself, a silent, damning chorus. On the very top of the pile, I placed a single sheet of crisp white paper. On it, in my neatest handwriting, I wrote one single, final line. "This is everything you no longer have access to." I thought I had the full picture of his betrayal. I thought the worst of it was the affair, the lies, the money he'd spent. But I was wrong. Gabe called me on Friday afternoon just as I was taping up the last of Derek's boxes. "Ivy," he said, and the grim tone in his gravelly voice immediately put me on alert. "I found something else. It's more than just travel and expenses." He told me he'd run a deeper financial search on Derek, something he did as standard procedure when things looked suspicious. He found a new bank account opened 3 weeks ago at a completely different bank, an account under Derek's name only. My blood ran cold. "He transferred $18,300 out of your joint savings into it 2 days before he left for Austin," Gabe explained. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. The box cutter in my hand felt heavy. This wasn't a man who had a moment of weakness and fell in love with someone else. This was a man who planned his escape with the precision of a bank robber. He had been systematically draining our shared resources while sending me texts about how much he missed me. This wasn't just an affair, it was a conspiracy. For the first time, I felt a tremor of fear. This wasn't just a breakup. I was the victim of a calculated plot. Gabe wasn't finished. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "He applied for a lease on a new luxury car last week." "A car lease?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We have 2 perfectly good cars, they're both paid off." "A top-of-the-line model," Gabe confirmed. "The kind of car you get when you're starting a flashy new life." He was rejected for the lease on his own. His credit's not good enough. Then came the gut punch, the blow that knocked all the air from my lungs. "So he reapplied," Gabe said slowly, "as a joint application. With you as the co-signer." I sank down onto one of the packed boxes, the cardboard groaning under my weight. "I never co-signed anything." "He used an e-signature," Gabe said, "your e-signature." "He forged it?" "He had forged my signature. He had committed a crime. He had tried to tie me and my good credit to a new, expensive debt for a life he planned to live without me. That was the point of no return. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was vaporized. Any shred of sympathy I might have harbored, any lingering thought of a civil or amicable divorce vanished in a flash of white-hot rage. This was fraud, and I had the proof. Gabe was already compiling the file, preparing to send it directly to Laura. I hung up with Gabe and immediately called Laura Chen. I told her everything, my voice no longer calm but tight with a controlled fury. The secret bank account, the forged signature on the car lease. She was silent on the other end of the line for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was sharp, a weapon being unsheathed. Ivy, she said, this is no longer just a divorce. This is a leverage event. She explained it in simple, brutal terms. The forged signature was a felony. We wouldn't press charges, she said. Not yet, we would use it. He's not just an unfaithful husband anymore, Laura told me, her voice ringing with confidence. He's a man who committed a crime to defraud you. This changes the entire negotiation. He doesn't get to ask for anything now. My goal had been to protect my assets and get out clean. Now, the goal was different. It was to ensure he walked away with absolutely nothing more than what was already in his new, secret bank account. The ticking clock was his return on Sunday. I had less than 48 hours to finalize my preparations for his welcome home party. I found the business card Laura had given me earlier in the week. I called Julie Carter, the real estate agent Laura had recommended. Julie, my name is Ivy Collins, I said when she answered. I need to list my house for sale. And I need the for sale sign in the yard by Sunday morning. The final day was a whirlwind of controlled activity. I packed a single suitcase for myself, one suitcase with my best clothes, my laptop, my important documents, and my toiletries. Everything else I owned could stay in the house for now. It was just stuff. The life I needed to carry with me was much lighter. I booked a room at a small, quiet inn about an hour outside the city, a place called the Willow Creek. It was run by a woman named Nora Benson, the inn's owner, whose website promised peace and privacy. It was a place Derek would never think to look for me, a place where I could be anonymous. I walked through the house one last time that Saturday evening. With his things packed away and the surfaces cleared, it looked sterile and impersonal, like a stage set after the play has ended. I walked into the dining room and placed the single white box dead center on the polished mahogany table. In the empty room, it seemed to have a gravitational pull, a silent, powerful presence. It was the only thing left out. I locked the front door, the click of the deadbolt echoing in the quiet street. I didn't look back. I got in my car and drove away. Before I reached the highway, I pulled over and made one last call. I hired a courier service. I gave them clear, simple instructions. They were to arrive at the house at 6 p.m. on Sunday, exactly 1 hour after his flight was scheduled to land. They weren't delivering a package. They were serving him with divorce papers. I'd already reviewed the petition with Laura. It included a brief, cutting reference to financial malfeasance. He would understand what that meant the moment he saw it. The inn was called the Willow Creek, and it was as peaceful as its name suggested. It was an old, beautifully maintained house set back from the road, surrounded by gardens. Nora Benson, the owner, was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a calm, no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She showed me to a room on the second floor overlooking a small, meticulously kept garden. She didn't ask any questions about why I was there alone with a single suitcase. She just handed me the key and said, "You look like you need some quiet, you'll find it here." The anonymity was a balm. In this quiet room, I was no longer Derek's wife. I was just Ivy, a guest in room 2B. And it was here, in the stillness of that first night away, that the major truth finally settled into my bones. It wasn't that he cheated on me that was the deepest wound. It was the chilling realization that he saw me as a resource to be drained, a signature to be forged, a logistical problem to be disposed of. My entire 10-year marriage had been a transaction that I hadn't understood I was a part of. The irreversible choice was made the moment I hired that courier. There was no walking this back. I wasn't just ending a marriage, I was liquidating a failed enterprise, and I was the sole shareholder. I had to accept the personal cost. The life I thought I had, the man I thought I loved, were complete illusions. The grief was real, a hollow ache in my chest, but I refused to let it be paralyzing. My goal was no longer just to get divorced. It was to build a life so solid, so completely and utterly mine, that no one could ever pull the foundation out from under me again. A few days later, Nora invited me to a small potluck dinner in the inn's dining room for some of the other long-term guests and a few of her local friends. I almost said no, wanting to retreat into the safety of my room, but something pushed me to go. I needed to be around people even if I didn't speak. There, while balancing a plate of food, I overheard a woman talking to a friend. She was recently divorced, and her voice was thick with anxiety as she described the financial mess her ex-husband had left her in. She didn't know where to start, how to create a budget, or even how to read the confusing statements that came in the mail. Listening to her, something clicked deep inside me. I knew how to do all of that. My skill for order, the very thing Derek had used and then tried to discard, was a valuable asset. For years, I had managed our complex finances, optimized our savings, and organized our entire lives down to the last detail. I had a skill set. The idea came to me fully formed, a flash of light in the darkness. I could start a small consulting business. I could help women just like her, women blindsided by divorce or other major life changes, to organize their finances and take back control. It wouldn't be about complicated investments or high-level financial planning. It would be about simple, steady routines. Creating budgets, tracking spending, organizing paperwork, building confidence one small step at a time. I would call it orderly exit. It was more than just a business idea. It was a lifeline. It was a mirror. It was a way to turn my meticulous nature from a domestic chore that made me invisible into a professional strength that would make me seen. The next morning, I didn't wake up with a sense of dread. I woke up with a purpose. I took my laptop and a cup of coffee out to the inn's quiet garden. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming roses. I didn't sit there and mourn my old life. I sat there and started building the new one. I bought the domain name for my business before I'd even finished my coffee. I sketched out a simple, clean, one-page website on a notepad. I created a list of services: budget creation, bill management, financial document organization. Simple, direct, unintimidating. That afternoon, I joined a local online support group for women going through divorce. For a few days, I didn't post anything. I just read their stories, their questions, their fears. The details were all different, but the underlying theme was the same: a feeling of being completely overwhelmed and powerless over their own money. Finally, I made a quiet post. It wasn't an advertisement, it was an offer. "Hello," I wrote. "I'm a personal financial organizer. If anyone needs help creating a simple budget to feel more in control, I'm offering my first 3 sessions for free. No strings attached, just want to help if I can." I closed my laptop, my heart pounding a little. It felt vulnerable putting myself out there like that, but within an hour a notification popped up. I had a private message. It was from a woman named Tara Brooks. Her message was short and to the point. "I saw your post. I'm drowning in bills I don't understand. I don't even know where to begin. Can you help me?" My phone was on silent, but I kept one eye glued to the little rectangle as if it were a tiny window into the world I'd just closed. 6:05 p.m. his flight had landed. I pictured him in an Uber, slick with travel fatigue, promising Sophie a glass of wine once they got home. I pictured them laughing about some shared private joke while I was somewhere outside of their story. I told myself I wouldn't be rattled by image or imagination. I'd planned for this. I'd done the work. The text started at 6:28 p.m., blunt, impatient. "Key isn't working. Did you change the locks?" A minute later. "Ivy, this isn't funny. The power is out. Open the door." He still thought this was a prank he could bully me out of. He still thought he could demand answers and I'd drop everything to respond. I didn't answer. I watched the messages stack up like dull pebbles on a windowsill. The world had become 2 separate things: the life I'd been forced into over and over, and the life I was building now, step by quiet step. He was on the old side, throwing things at me I was no longer obligated to catch. On the street outside the house, someone probably paused under the "for sale" sign Julie had put in the yard that morning. That sign was not a flourish of spite, it was a formal statement. The house was my asset, my name was on the deed, and the day it left my hands would be when I chose. He'd always assumed home was a place he could return to, as if restoration were a given. I imagined Sophie's face when she saw the bold letters and the realtor's neat logo. Confusion, then irritation, then the slow realization that the grand theatrical return she'd been promised was a lie built on purchased champagne and my money. I left him to the dark house and the silent, sleeping appliances he'd never bothered to understand. I watched the screen until my coffee went cold. My silence was deliberate. Let him pound on the locked door, let him call, let him plead. Silence was part of the plan. It made the truth louder. The calls started right after the texts. I let every single one roll to voicemail because I didn't want him to feel the satisfaction of hearing me flinch. The first message was clipped and furious. "Ivy, call me back right now. What the hell is going on? There's a for sale sign in the yard and a courier just handed me a packet. Is this some kind of joke?" His voice was all adrenaline. He expected shock to look like surrender. The second voicemail came 3 minutes later, thinner at the edges. "The card declined at dinner. My debit card isn't working either. Where did you run off to?" Sophie is freaking out. "What did you do?" There was a scraping sound at the end, like someone shoving a phone back into a pocket, then the one I expected. It tried on the tone of regret and weakness like an actor trying a costume. "Ivy, honey, I know you're hurting. I messed up. I never should have sent that text. But we can talk about this. Don't do this. You're destroying our life." He said our life, the old phrase, the one that had been a brand, a contract he'd now violated. The plea was hollow because it left out the part where he'd quietly been stealing our money, forging my signature, and booking romance suites. After 3 voicemails, his voice changed. The bluster dropped from it, replaced by a brittle edge I hadn't heard before. The last message that night was a single sentence delivered with someone's dignity finally cracking. "Ivy, we need to talk. Call me." No charm, no pleading. Just a small request from a man who suddenly sounded afraid. I let the messages sit in my mailbox like relics. If he wanted to climb through a window, break a lock, and come back into a house that was now a legal and logistical minefield, that was his choice. I'd arranged a courier to hand him divorce papers. I'd asked the utility companies to shut the warm hum off at 8 a.m. Sunday. I didn't want him to feel like I'd done it out of spite. I wanted him to understand that I'd done it because I valued myself. I didn't see him open the white box. I wasn't there to hear the sound of the lid being lifted, the rustle of photographs sliding against one another. What I had instead were little confirmations. A voicemail later that night with a strangled, half-sobbed bark of anger, an image Gabe sent me showing a man in a dark kitchen, phone clutched in one hand and a glossy photo in the other. A text from Julie saying she'd seen him take a packet from a courier and then sit on the front steps staring at it. I pictured it the way a director might imagine a scene. The dining room light was off, the house quieter than I'd ever left it, the polished table reflecting the dim twilight outside. He would lift the lid and first see our wedding pictures, candid shots, the ones where we were laughing so hard at the reception that our faces looked raw and real. He would flip through them, expecting something to sting or shame him into action, but those pictures were small and dumbly cheerful. They looked like props from a life he'd only half inhabited. Underneath the photos were the bank statements. I'd taken the time to annotate them in thick, black ink. I had circled every charge from Austin and underlined every late-night ATM withdrawal with a steady hand. I'd printed the hotel receipt from the Ember and red circled the couple's massage, the champagne, the pair of monogrammed robes. I'd laid the photo of him and Sophie on top, the one Gabe had found, the two of them smiling at a cafe with sunlight in Sophie's hair. At the very top, the one line I'd written in my neatest script, "This is everything you no longer have access to." I could imagine his face as he read it. Surprise at first, the reflexive look of a man who thought he'd covered his tracks. Then anger, a hot, animal thing that made his jaw hard. Then, after the phone call with the bank and the bag of cards turned useless, confusion, then the thin, new animal of fear. The divorce packet the courier had handed him would have felt like salt poured on an open wound. He'd read the words and then reread them as if repetition could make the consequences smaller. I pictured him frantically rifling through drawers looking for cash, for some hidden stash, as if the house's cash box could rewind what he'd already decided. He'd shout Sophie's name, he'd curse. He might even tear a photograph in half or throw the papers against the wall in a sudden, theatrical rage. Rage is an attempt to restore control by making noise. I had removed his tools for that. Later that night, I got an email from Gabe with a single image attached. Sophie was walking down the driveway dragging a small suitcase, her hair in a loose ponytail. She looked tired and pissed off in a way I recognized as entitlement bumped up against reality. A taxi idled at the curb. She leaned into it with the kind of impatience that people who have never had to struggle with money develop. In the photo, she didn't look back. Her leaving didn't feel like triumph. I didn't clap or dance. It felt more like the settling of dust after an explosion. For all their glossy pictures and staged vacations, she hadn't signed up for a life where convenience and luxury evaporated overnight. Her exit was practical, almost bored. Without the charm of taking him out to a show and turning on the lights for an Instagram story, she had no reason to stay. The version of Derek she'd fallen for was a fiction funded by someone else's sweat and foresight. That fiction collapsed and she left. I felt a cold wash of relief and then something quieter, pity, not for Sophie, really. For the man she left behind, suddenly stripped of the theatrical props he'd relied on. He stood in a dark house in a box-strewn living room with photos that showed a life he'd apparently chosen to ruin. The cost of his decisions was unspooling around him, not in the sudden loss of a girlfriend but in the steady depletion of the luxuries he'd always assumed were his by right. 2 days after the courier packet and Sophie's taxi, Nora came to my door with the same calm look she'd given me when she first checked me in. I was sitting in the inn's small parlor, a scarf around my shoulders, a mug that had gone lukewarm. The sunlight outside the window made the dust motes look like tiny planets in a quiet sky. It almost felt like a different kind of life until Nora's voice nudged me back. "There's a man at the front desk asking for you," she said. Her face was calm, but her eyes were practical. "He matches the description of the husband you didn't mention." There was a spike of something under my skin, fear, sharp and hot. He'd tracked me down. For a half second, the old reflex came back. Run upstairs, lock the door, pretend I wasn't here. But the reflex was shallow. Experience had taught me to trade that brief thrill for steadier, more effective moves. I folded the scarf tighter around my neck and stood up. "Please tell him I'm not here and that if he doesn't leave you'll call the police," I said, my voice level. It sounded small in the room, like throwing a match into a bucket of water. She nodded, already on my mind. "Don't you worry." I appreciated the blunt, practical kindness. Nervousness prickled at the back of my throat, but it was more annoyance than panic. He was still trying to force a confrontation on his terms to make me come out and fix the mess he made. He'd learn, as many men do, that some doors don't open no matter how loudly you knock. But the fact he'd come looking meant something else had changed. He'd stopped pretending his problem could be solved with charm and had accepted it might require effort. That effort was frightening because it often led to unpredictable moves, showing up, escalating, breaking windows, begging in public. Nora's calmness steadied me, but I felt the old clock running faster. The timeline that had been in my head, filed, neat, and manageable, was suddenly more jagged. I couldn't stay hidden forever. I hadn't wanted to be hunted. I'd wanted a resolution that didn't involve police reports. But the man at the front desk showed that the space for negotiation was closing. I told Nora I'd stay in the library until she called. She offered me tea and sat with me for a few minutes, not asking any questions, just occupying the room like a human shield. I let her do it. Outside, a car door slammed, then another. Voices drifted in and out of hearing range. I listened for the sound of a man's shoes on gravel, for the cadence of a voice I knew too well. For the first time since I'd left the house, I felt a small, honest fear. It was manageable. It had a shape. It would fit into a plan. When Nora called down to the front desk again, she said, "He's asked to see the manager. He's asking if Ivy Collins is checked in and whether she's available." Her tone was flat, a line delivered like a fact. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The next moves would have to be careful. This wasn't the first escalation I'd planned for in my head, but it was the first I hadn't wanted to actually happen. The room hummed with the faint sound of a kettle. I set my mug down and considered the long list of steps still on my yellow legal pad. Some things had to wait for lawyers and their emails, others had to be immediate. I was tired, but I was not undone. I had a team and I had a plan, and now, apparently, another thing to add. A man who'd come looking for me and found an inn near who'd call the police if he made a scene. I called Laura immediately. "He's here, at the inn," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Nora had just told me, and I could hear her moving about the inn in the background, the small domestic sounds that made the place feel lived in and real. Laura's answer was short and sharp, the way surgeons speak right before they cut. "Okay," she said, "it's time, we're sending the email." We had talked about this possibility before, late into the night while I packed boxes and Laura mapped out the edges of what we could do. The forged signature had been our secret weapon, the one we'd held back until the right moment. Now the right moment had arrived. I told Laura Nora had his car description and the words he'd used at the desk. She didn't hesitate. She read me what she was going to send while I sat on the armchair in the inn's small parlor, my fingers worrying the seam of my sleeve. The email was short and unadorned, exactly as she'd promised. It was addressed to his lawyer and said plainly that we had proof Derek had used my signature to apply for a luxury car lease. It stated that we didn't want to take the matter to the police, but that if Derek kept harassing me if he tried to force contact, or if he contested the division of property, we would have no choice but to let authorities review the forged documents. It was not a threat of violence or drama, it was a boundary drawn in language. "You sure you want me to send it?" Laura asked. She was giving me the last small chance to back down, to choose the quieter, slower path. I thought about the cruise nights he'd missed, the late payments he'd made when I'd covered him, the way he'd smiled and expected the world to rearrange around him. I thought of the cardboard boxes in our garage and the little white box on the table. I thought about Sophie's tagged photos and the bank withdrawals circled in red ink. "Yes," I said, "send it." She hit send. The sound of that small action felt like a physical weight leaving my chest. It was ridiculous how ordinary the act was, no drum roll, no flourish, just a click, and yet in that click something decisive landed. The trap was sprung. For the next 10 minutes I waited in the parlor while Nora pretended to go about her business. She puttered, made tea, laid out a small plate of cookies. The domestic scene was deliberate, like a set piece that said nothing unusual was happening. I scrolled through my phone, checking for a reply. My heart kept finding new ways to hammer against my ribs and then settle like waves on a stone. Then my phone buzzed. A forwarded message from Laura, Derek's lawyer, had replied. The tone was defensive and short. He confirmed his client had been surprised and distressed, that he would cooperate with negotiations, and that he would advise his client not to approach me. It wasn't an admission of guilt on Derek's part. It was, however, a line in the sand. We had carved out a space where the only route he could take was one negotiated by his counsel. For the next hours, then days, the ball of action would sit in lawyers' inboxes instead of in my living room. That gap felt like breathing room. While we let that settle, Nora handed me a small stack of folded sheets with names and phone numbers scribbled on them, local women who'd used the inn as a refuge, people who might need the kind of help I was offering. I felt a small, steady tug toward doing something useful with the skill that had been used against me. Right then, out of a silence that smelled faintly of lavender and fresh bread, Tara Brooks texted to confirm a time to meet. We met in the inn's tiny library the next morning. The room had low shelves, a rug with a few faded threads, and a window that looked out over a small patch of roses Nora kept clipped and tidy. Tara arrived with a shoebox clenched in both hands like a child holding a secret. She set it on the table between us and sat down, folding her hands on top like someone who didn't trust the floor to hold her. "I feel so stupid," she said before the box was even opened. Her voice was small and raw. "He handled everything, bills, insurance, all that. Now he's gone and I don't even know how to pay the electric. I don't know where to start. "You're not stupid," I told her. I could see how tired she was, how frightened. I'd been there more than once in my life. There's a hollow feeling when you realize a person you trusted with the map of your life doesn't care if you get lost. You're starting from a place where you don't have the information. That's different from not being able to learn it. We took the shoebox apart like surgeons: receipts, unopened envelopes, a few folded bills. The first step was small and literal. We sorted the paperwork into 3 piles: what's due in the next week, what's due soon, and what can wait. Tara watched as I wrote down the amounts and due dates in my neat block letters. I showed her how to list income and fixed expenses, how to prioritize rent or mortgage, utilities, and car insurance. No talk of stocks or retirement funds yet, just the immediate things that keep a roof over your head. She had never used online banking, but she had a smartphone. I walked her through setting up an account on the bank's simple app, helping her type in passwords, confirming numbers, and showing her how to check a balance. When she made her first online payment, tiny, a fraction of what she owed, her hands shook. She laughed, a surprised little sound, and then started crying, but they were tears that carried relief with them. It was small and yet enormous. We set up automatic payments for her car insurance and utilities so she wouldn't have to remember every deadline. I showed her how to make a simple spreadsheet to track spending, color-coded so it wasn't overwhelming. She left our meeting with a plan, her receipt box lighter, the lists folded into her wallet. Before she walked away, she turned back and said, "I didn't know I could do this." I told her, "Honestly, you did it. I just showed you how." Helping Tara felt like patching a part of myself back together. The knowledge I'd kept tucked away: how to organize accounts, how to read statements, how to set up a clean schedule for bills, wasn't shameful. It was a skill. Each time a woman I helped did something as tiny as an online payment, I felt that seed of quiet confidence grow a little more in me. Later that evening, while I was organizing notes from our meeting and drafting a simple template for a budget sheet I could give to future clients, an email from Laura landed in my inbox. I opened it expecting the usual lawyer speak. Instead, she'd forwarded a message from Derek's attorney with one line and nothing more. "Mr. Shaw agrees to all terms outlined in the initial divorce petition and will cease all contact with Miss Collins immediately." I read the sentence twice. The words were small and black and ordinary on the screen, but they carried the weight of a bell. It was over. He'd folded, not with a public apology or a dramatic surrender, but in the quiet, practical way that tends to happen when the consequences of lies become too costly. The forged signature, it turned out, was the hinge that swung the door closed. He couldn't deny what was on paper without exposing himself to an investigation that would not only be messy but likely ruinous. I didn't feel triumphant, at least not the way thriller novels describe triumph. There was no champagne, no dramatic smile. Instead, there was a stillness that felt almost like exhaustion. I sat back in my chair and let the silence in. The inn hummed softly around me, the distant clink of cutlery, Nora moving in the kitchen, a radio softly playing a song I couldn't name. I allowed myself a tiny exhale, a small release of tension I'd been holding in my shoulders for days. The surrender felt like a door sliding shut rather than a battle one. There was relief, yes, but there was also a clean, empty space where the clamor used to be. The war that had occupied every waking hour, the frantic planning, the small, controlled acts of sabotage had been replaced by an after. I had expected fireworks and instead found this muted, honest calm. The day after Derek's lawyer agreed, a strange emptiness settled over me. For weeks, my life had been a tight string of tasks: freeze accounts, hire a private investigator, pack boxes, coordinate with utilities. Everything had been forward momentum. Now there were no calls to make, no receipts to circle, no deadlines that mattered except the ones I chose. I walked through the small town near the inn to clear my head. Shops with bright awnings glinted in the late afternoon sun. A playground echoed with children's laughter. Couples walked dogs, holding hands in a rhythm that made my chest ache in an unfamiliar way. I watched a young family at a picnic table, the father cutting sandwiches while the mother chased a toddler who'd abandoned a shoe. I felt a tug of something that wasn't jealousy. It was a sense of loss for the imagined life I'd once thought I had. Not the lie Derek had lived, but the idea itself, the shared jokes, the casual presence of another body in the night, the small rituals that pretend to mean safety. I had won the fight on terms that felt clean and necessary, but the victory left a quiet I hadn't anticipated. The inn was less a sanctuary now and more an in-between place. Safe, yes, but not yet home. I'd traded chaos for a schedule of appointments and lawyer emails, but the space where someone else used to be remained a physical absence I could feel in the cadence of my steps. It was as if the world tilted and I had to learn to walk on a new plane. That evening, sitting in my room with the blinds half drawn, I let the silence hold me. I had avoided feeling the deeper things while I acted. Now there was time. I had time to notice the ache that had been there under the adrenaline, the pattern that had threaded through my life far before Derek's text. My core wound wasn't simply that a man cheated. It was the realization that for much of my life I'd been valued for the things I did, not for who I was. My mom and dad praised me for being the responsible one, the steady one. When I was a teenager, my mom would say, "Ivy, you're so practical, you make everything run." My dad would joke in that proud, distracted way parents have, "We can always count on Ivy to handle it." Those words were meant as praise, but they had a second life as instructions. Be the one who holds the list, who remembers the deadlines, who repairs the holes so no one else has to be uncomfortable. I carried that role into my marriage without noticing. I'd never been asked if I wanted it. Derek slid into an arrangement that fit it perfectly. He liked the person who scheduled things, who found the cheapest insurance, who could reschedule a dentist appointment without drama. He appreciated the results and rarely the labor. Over time, the labor became invisible to him. It became the air he breathed. When he needed a safety net, he used it. When it was inconvenient to care about the person who created that net, he didn't. Recognizing that was a kind of grief I hadn't expected. It's one thing to be cheated on. It's another to see the larger pattern and realize it had been there all along, in choices mom and dad praised, in habits I cultivated to feel capable and useful. My identity had been flattened into a function. That understanding stung sharply, but it also changed the work I needed to do. The business idea wasn't just a way to make money. It was a project of translation, taking the skills that had been made invisible and turning them into something that belonged to me and that I could use to connect, not to disappear. The loneliness came up again in small, familiar ways, reaching for the phone in the middle of the night and remembering there was no message waiting, waking to an empty bed and feeling the soft, useless pang of missing. But under the loneliness was a kind of newfound clarity. I'd mapped the problem. I could teach others how not to be blindsided the way I had been. And maybe, if I built this right, I could also teach myself how to be valued for who I was, not only for what I did. Tara's text felt like a small, warm ping in a week that otherwise hummed with quiet endings. "I did it," she wrote. "I made a budget for next month and paid my own car insurance online. I can't believe it. Thank you." She sent a screenshot, her spreadsheet, neat columns, color-coded, every line a tiny, steady thing she could point to and say, "I did this." I sat on the inn's front steps in the late afternoon sun, my hands wrapped around a mug Nora had given me when I first arrived. The steam curled up and vanished like a secret. For a long time, my skills had been invisible, folded into the background of someone else's life. Watching Tara's message felt like watching a small plant poke through cracked concrete. It was a fragile thing, yes, but it was real. That night I answered her with a longer message than I usually sent. I didn't make it about me, about the cleverness of my plan or the victory over Derek. I made it about her. "You did that," I wrote, "not me. You made the steps. Be proud." I added a little how-to about setting a reminder for bills and suggested a low-cost app for tracking spending. She replied with a string of thanks and a selfie of a closed laptop and a cup of tea, smiling. Those small interactions were the purchase of a new life. Helping Tara and then a neighbor and then another woman from the support group, I saw a pattern repeat. The first online payment, the first automatic bill set up, the first time someone said, "I didn't know I could do this." Each was a tiny reclamation. My work wasn't going to be glamorous. It wasn't about headline-making wins. It was mundane, slow, stubborn work that returned a measure of control to someone who had been made powerless. That possibility, building a business on a skill I'd been taught to hide, felt both dangerous and hopeful. It was dangerous because it required me to keep connecting with people, to risk being seen again. It was hopeful because, for the first time in a long time, the skill that had rendered me invisible was what made me visible and valuable on my own terms. I started sketching brochures and a simple client intake form, and with each small act I felt the old, tight knot of panic loosen a little. 3 months passed before I heard from Derek in the way I expected him to. Indirect, filtered, safe. His request came through Laura, then a forwarded note from his lawyer, then my inbox. He wanted to meet, just for a coffee, he said. He claimed he needed to understand what had happened, to find out what went wrong, to say he was sorry. The message was careful, like a man practicing the lines he wanted to use. Laura advised against it. "There's no reason to let him back into your life," she said. "He's a liability, not a person you owe comfort to." She was right in the blunt, necessary way lawyers are when they see risk. But I knew something else. Some endings needed witnesses. I wasn't going for closure for him. I was going for a public, quiet ending that I could witness myself. I needed to see him sober, reduced to the man his choices had made him into, and to be the one to close the book. So I agreed to one meeting, 30 minutes, neutral ground, a busy coffee shop with a bustling crowd where no one would watch too closely. I told Laura the time and place. I bought a simple dress the week before, something clean and professional, the kind of outfit I wore when I met new clients. It was modest, not flashy, and it felt like armor that fit. On the day, the coffee shop smelled like espresso and warm pastries. It was noisy enough that he couldn't stage a scene. He was already there when I walked in, hunched over a cup, looking smaller than I expected. The years had added a tightness around his mouth. He stood when I approached, for form's sake, and then sat again, folding his hands in that way men do when they have rehearsed their apologies. He started in the direction I'd imagined, about Sophie, about losing her, about how hard it had been, how he'd made a terrible mistake. He framed himself as the one who had stumbled because of weakness, not the one who had planned and lied. He tried to steer the conversation toward feelings, toward something soft and human that might pull me into a protective role. I let him talk. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup and listened the way I used to listen when I took notes for a meeting. Focused, detached, cataloging details. There was no rush to interrupt because I already knew his lines. I'd read too many of them across bank statements and hotel bills and the white box on the dining room table. When he finally paused, expecting a response that would soothe or inflame, I said calmly, "You didn't make a mistake, Derek. You made a plan. Plans don't just happen by accident." My voice was even. There was no dramatic flourish, only a truth that felt heavy and ordinary. "You took steps to build a life you wanted without me, and you counted on me not noticing. That's not regret. That's calculation." He looked as if he'd been struck by a simple, clear fact. He tried to reach for the old playbook, blame the exhaustion, blame a single bad decision, plead for a second chance, but the leash had been cut. I paid off a motif I'd been carrying. "You thought the house was a building. You never saw it as my foundation. You treated my work like a service, not like a labor that mattered." He faltered. The conversation that followed was hollow. He tried to paint himself as a man who had lost his way. He offered vague promises of being better without any acknowledgement of the costs he'd already exacted. I stayed quiet, not out of cruelty, but because I was tired of being asked to correct his view of himself. Some people will never understand the work behind the order. Some people will only ever value what is convenient. When he wound down, he looked at me like a person expecting a performance. Tears, a shout, a plea, anything to show he still mattered. I gave him none of it. Instead, I reached into my purse, set a $10 bill on the table to cover our coffees, and stood up. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for," I said, slow and clear, "but you won't find it by looking backward." He stared, stunned, a man preparing for a fight who had instead received a verdict. I walked out of the coffee shop and didn't look back. The city noise folded over my shoulders like an indifferent blanket. He could sit there with his regret and his coffee. He could file petitions and make calls and try to stitch his life back from the scraps. He was a problem I had already solved. After that, practical things moved quickly. The house sale that Julie had put up for market closed a week after the coffee shop. It was a clean process: inspections, paperwork, signatures, and then the keys changed hands. Watching Julie hand the new owners a set of shiny brass keys was oddly cathartic. The house would be someone else's responsibility now, and that felt right. I moved into a small apartment downtown. It was half the size of the colonial Derek and I had once shared, but it was mine in a way that felt deep and funny and a little sacred. I set the couch against the window, bought a lamp that cast warm light on late-night spreadsheets, and hung a few prints that made me smile. It was enough space for one person to breathe and to build something with intention. Orderly exit, my little business began to find its rhythm. Tara became a friend, not just a client. Word spread in the local support circles, and soon I had a steady trickle of women who wanted simple, sensible help getting their lives in order. I kept my service honest, no big promises about wealth, just practical, doable steps. A spreadsheet, a system for bills, a few conversations about what people could do if things went sideways. I had clients who came with shoeboxes of receipts and left with a plan. I had one woman who cried when she finally scheduled automatic payments because she felt like she had reclaimed an hour of her week. Another woman, a retired teacher, wanted help organizing her paperwork so she could spend her summers traveling. Little victories accumulated. They stitched together a life that, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged to me. My new equilibrium was quiet, deliberate, and slow. I woke up with a to-do list I had written for a life I was building rather than one I was maintaining for someone else. I ate breakfast at a counter that held only what I needed. I answered emails from clients and scheduled sessions in the afternoons. I met Tara for dinner sometimes, and we laughed about small things: the absurdity of online banking, the freedom of no longer sharing a Netflix password with someone who took it for granted. There was a visible cost. I wore a new kind of armor, a guardedness in my laugh, a pattern of watching intent behind people's words. Trust was no longer easy, but life was also quieter in a way that let me listen to my own voice without it being drowned out by someone else's demands. The rhythm I'd built wasn't flashy, but it sounded right when I listened. Steady work, small victories, nights I came home to an apartment that felt like mine. Sometimes when I cooked a small pot of sauce, garlic, basil, a little crushed tomato, I'd breathe in and feel the old habit of waiting loosen. The smell no longer meant waiting for Derek to come home. It meant I was cooking for one, and that one was exactly who I wanted to be. I had traded chaos for clarity and silence for strength. I had kept my anchor, my inheritance, my name. The rest was new and slow and mine, and that was enough. The cost of my freedom showed up in small, sharp ways. I moved through my days with a new kind of armor. Polite, measured, and slightly wary. People asked me about the divorce as if it were a headline and not the quiet collapse of a life, and I answered with the clipped patience of someone who'd been through a furnace. I trusted my judgment more than I ever had, and I trusted other people's motives less. That meant I missed a lot of easy, small talk that used to slip into friendships. I learned to listen for what people wanted from me: a favor, empathy, an audience, and I hesitated before I gave it. There were nights I missed the easy comfort of the old arrangement. Even knowing how hollow it had been, I felt the ache of a body used to another body in bed beside it. I caught myself reaching for the phone at odd hours, expecting a text that never came. I missed the voice that had once narrated half my life, even if that voice had been unreliable. Grief arrived in slices: a recipe we always cooked together, a chair left empty at a dinner, a throw pillow that held his scent until I washed it out. Each loss was a small, private thing that I carried and then learned to set down. Mom used to praise me for being dependable. "Ivy, you keep everything together," she'd say, and those words had felt like a medal for years. Now they sounded more like instructions I had obeyed without asking. I still do the work others used to expect of me, but I do it for myself, not as proof of my value to someone else. That change came with a price. A sharper edge to my kindness, a slower willingness to hand over trust. The scar is visible in how I plan trips, how I answer calls, how I sign my name. But it's not all damage, it's also a map of the work I did to get here. One evening, 3 months after the courier came and the stacks of receipts were filed, I stood in my small kitchen and let the stove warm the apartment. I had a single pot of sauce simmering, the garlic and basil scent curling around the light. I stirred slowly, listening to the soft hiss of the tomato and oil. The apartment felt like a place I'd built one careful choice at a time: a lamp where I wanted light, a bookshelf that held books I'd actually read, a chair that fit me. I looked out the window at the city lights and my phone sat on the counter face down. I wasn't waiting for a message. I didn't have to check a bank app to feel safe. The quiet around me felt different, full, not empty. I thought of the white box on the dining table that had held the evidence of his choices. I thought of the boxes I'd packed and the small business cards I handed to women at the support group. I thought of Tara's spreadsheet, the way she sent me a photo with a grin like she just climbed a small mountain. The sound of that memory was softer than victory. It was the hum of something steady starting. I am Ivy Collins. I am 35 now, and for the first time in a long time, home smells like basil because I made the sauce for me. If you've ever had to start over, share your story below. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and survival, and I'll see you in the next video.